Let's get to it. I'm excited. You have a new book. Today we're talking about a feminist hero. You've probably never heard of Charlotte Lottie Dod. She was a 5-time Wimbledon singles champion in the late 19th century. She was also a golf champion, a skilled mountaineer, an endurance bicyclist, a toboggan racer, a field hockey pioneer, and a 1908 Olympic silver medalist in archery. How have I not heard of her before? Because my textbooks only focus on history, very little on herstory. Here to talk about her legacy is our regular guest, Sasha Abramsky, whose new book is Little Wonder, the fabulous story of Lottie Dodd, the world's first female sports superstar. Sasha, congratulations on the book.
Thank you. Thank you. It's really a fun thing to be talking about tennis instead of Donald Trump's brain all the time. So
yes, we usually talk to you about politics and the impending fascism. Talk about why you decided to write a book about an athlete.
All right. Well, I'll tell you what, because I know that at least some of your audience are just not going to understand why I'm not talking about politics today. So let me try and blend the two. So I have two obsessions, and your audience knows one of my obsessions because I come on every 2 weeks and I talk about it. I love politics. I love trying to understand what's happening in the world. I love trying to understand all the social forces that shape the environment that I live in, that my community is a part of. That's one of my obsessions. But my hidden obsession that I've always had since I was sort of 4 or 5 years old has been tennis. And, you know, when you're a kid, you think, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, I'm an astronaut, I'm going to be a fireman. Well, my first career ambition was I was going to be Wimbledon champion. I wasn't just going to be a tennis player, but I had a very specific career goal. I was going to be Bjorn Borg, the Swedish tennis player in the 70s who had this dashing blonde hair and headband and everything else. And that was my sort of career ambition. Didn't happen.
You could still wear the headband. We would be okay with that.
You know, my dad, whenever I go back to England, I played tennis in the park, and a couple of years ago I was feeling a bit achy and I wasn't playing, and he said, what a waste, you're so good. I think my dad still thinks in his heart of hearts I could be Wimbledon champion. I'm a little bit too old to make the career change at this choice. But
well, the place I moved to, that's all the people do here is play tennis and go to tennis pro shops, and there's a lot of tennis, so you could come and visit if you're on this coast.
Do a book reading. But the thing is, like any sports fan, any sports obsessed fan, I pride myself on sort of, you know, knowing the minutiae of the sport. And I thought I knew all the great characters. You'd mention a name and I say, oh yes, she won this, that, and the other. And I went down to Wimbledon on a tour, behind the scenes tour after the tournament a couple of years back. And I went into the basement. There's a wonderful museum. If you're a tennis aficionado, it's, you know, probably the greatest tennis museum in the world. And in one corner of that museum, there was an exhibit on late 19th century tennis stars. And a lot of them I'd heard of, people like William Renshaw, who was the male champion of Wimbledon 7 times in the 1880s. But there was a woman there, a young woman called Lottie Dodd. There was a photograph of her and a little bit about her, how she'd first won Wimbledon at the age of 15. And my eyes sort of started going in circles in my head, because if you know anything about tennis, you know that nobody wins a Grand Slam tennis tournament at 15. It's never been done. Except it had been done once, 140 years ago nearly, by this then teenage girl called Lottie Dodd. And I got kind of fascinated. And I went back to the Wimbledon archives every day that week, and I started tooling around in, you know, these really musty old sports journals that were bound in volumes. And I realized I'd stumbled on hidden history. And, you know, for a journalist, whether you're writing about politics, history, whatever you're writing about, you want to find something unexpected, something that nobody or not very many people have covered before. And there's this story of this woman who in the 1880s, 1890s, and early 1900s, with this backdrop of the suffragette movement and all of the turmoil around women's rights and women's suffrage and so on, this woman had basically decided, I'm going to do whatever I want to do. I'm not going to let anybody tell me just because I'm a woman I can't compete at this level or I can't enter this sporting contest. I'm going to do it. And she did it. And she went from one sport to the next, to the next, to the next. And she wasn't just sort of marginally good. She wasn't a dilettante who went around and sort of, you know, played a little bit of garden party tennis and a little bit of garden party golf. She was really bloody good. And, you know, as a fan as well as a writer, the more I read, the more I realized, you know, this woman was doing things that were 100 years ahead of her time. And she was doing them with no apologies and no second guessing. And I found it a completely fascinating story. So I dived into the archives and spent a couple of years when I wasn't thinking about Donald Trump and about, immigration policy and about illegal executive orders and everything else. For my downtime, I was thinking about tennis and how to construct the narrative that eventually became this book, Little Wonder.
Well, we're happy to have you here because we just spoke right before you with John Nichols, who talked about Biden's VP pick. And after this, we actually have a third interview coming on with Alex Lawson talking about how Trump is destroying Social Security. So I think that might be all we can take of those topics.
It might be, but let me ask a question. What did my dear friend John Nichols say about the vice presidency? What's his bet at?
Well, he is advocating for someone who he believes would be, a really progressive powerhouse. He believes that, Karen Bass is the running mate that he believes would be the best choice. At the end, he said he wasn't sure that was going to be the choice, although she made it onto the short list. But we did discuss Bass, and we came to think that even if she doesn't get picked, we are elevating her national profile among activists here because she is, again, another little known figure in national politics, although she's beloved in her local area. Lottie Dodd, can we talk a little bit about the thing that fascinates me about this story, and I mentioned it at the top, was how history everyone knows who Babe Ruth is. Is Charlotte Dodd not the first woman teenager to win Wimbledon, as you've said? Why do you think that history has skipped over talking about her?
Well, there are a few reasons, and the sort of easy reason is that she's a woman in a world of sports that certainly in the 1880s and 90s was dominated and defined by men. But it's not just that. I mean, you mentioned Babe Ruth. There's another Babe from the 1900s, a female Babe Dickerson Zaharias, who is extraordinarily famous because she won all kinds of sports. She was an American, a little bit like Lottie Dodd in terms of her ability to jump from sport to sport. But she was 40 years later. And so she was operating in a world where there was Hollywood, there were movies, there were cinema imagery of her, there was radio capturing her voice. She was operating in an electronic media world that made it easier to preserve her memory over time. And Babe Dickerson Zaharias loved being in the media spotlight. She was very aggressive about sort of asserting herself into the media spotlight. Lottie Dodd never was. She operated in a print media environment. She was a sportswoman into her late 30s in 1908. And so there is half a minute, 30 seconds of crackly old film footage of her shooting off her arrows at the 1908 Olympics when she was competing in archery. And there's 90 seconds from 1926 when she participated in a ceremony at Wimbledon where the king and queen gave medals to ex-champions. It was the 50th anniversary of the tournament. So in this woman's entire career, and she lived to be 90 years old, and she had all kinds of interesting adventures after she was a sportswoman, but in her nearly 90 years, there's all of 2 minutes of film footage of her. And as far as I can tell, there's not a single radio interview. Mm-hmm. So I think partly she vanishes because she was just too early for electronic media. I think the second thing is that she was actually quite reclusive, and that even though in her heyday, she knew how to use the media, she was often profiled in Society magazine, she was a darling of the sports journalism world. In those years, she was very able and willing to be a part of the media circus. When she left sports, and in the World War I period, she became a volunteer nurse. It was called the Volunteer Aid Detachment, and women of a certain class, aristocratic, moneyed women in England, flocked to the Volunteer Aid Detachment. And people like Vera Brittain, the writer, or Agatha Christie, the mystery novelist, they were all Volunteer Aid Detachment nurses in World War I. Lottie Dodd was a part of that. And then after World War I, she retreats into not exactly isolation. She was a madrigals singer. Madrigals are Tudor folk songs, basically, the kind of songs that English people would have been singing in Henry VIII.
Falling in love with her more and more as you.
I desperately, I found her sort of desperately compelling personality to write about. So she's doing all these things. She's singing in concerts all around England. She's performing at certain times at Buckingham Palace when she was ordered in by the King and Queen to perform madrigals. I think at one point she does some volunteer teaching of piano music and singing to poor kids in the East End of London. But she's doing it all out of the media spotlight. So every so often you can see her name appear in a Madrigal Society program, or she becomes the secretary at one point of the society, the Singing Society. And so in adverts, her phone number is listed. You can buy tickets at the Aeolian Hall, or if you'd prefer, you can phone Miss Lottie Dodd directly at 5 Trebevere Road in Earl's Court and purchase the tickets from her. So it's not that she vanishes entirely, but by about 1910 or 1911, the sports world journalists have moved away from her. You know, they found their next sensations. And in tennis, later on, for female tennis stars, it would have been Suzanne Lenglen or Helen Wills Moody. And so they move on to other stories. And I think Lottie Dodd made no effort to keep the embers alive. She made no effort to stay in the spotlight. I think she quite enjoyed her anonymity. She never got married. She never had kids. I think she became a little bit eccentric the older she got.
I love her.
Yeah, I mean, the woman's fascinating.
Yeah, she really flouted sort of the societal norms of her time, it seems.
She did. I mean, look, if you think of what a woman, and certainly an upper middle class woman like Lottie Dodd, would have been expected to do in life, there was a roadmap laid out. She would have had a sort of baseline education by governesses at her house. Then she would have gone on, and by the time she was in her teens, she would have been attending debutante balls and so on. By the time she was in her 20s, she would have found a man and gotten married. And then she would have had children. And that would have been that. She would have had no career. She would have had no financial independence. Her life would have been defined through her husband's accomplishments. And that was the life that many of her contemporaries led. She had no interest in that. She never got married. She never had kids. I don't know her sexuality. She's sort of not exactly explicit about it in what letters I have found. She certainly never wanted to make her story second to someone else's story. And so she did what she wanted to do. She was financially independent. She'd inherited money from her father, who died when she was a child. He was a very wealthy cotton merchant. And he made sure that Lottie, Lottie's sister Anne, and Lottie's two brothers, Anthony and William, were all financially independent. So she was comfortable.
Was she looked unfavorably upon or shunned at all by the rest of her class?
Not at all. She was part of this very interesting, eccentric, adventurous sort of upper crust in the Victorian period. And that generation produced really interesting characters. So you have people like the Antarctic explorer Ernest Shackleton. You have people like the first man to really make a good faith effort to conquer Mount Everest, a guy called George Mallory. You have these mountaineers, you have these explorers, you have these sports figures. And in Lottie Dodd's case, a lot of the sports figures would congregate in Switzerland, in places like St. Moritz and Davos in the winter months. And it was where the adventurous and somewhat eccentric upper crust of Victorian, not just England, but America, Argentina, Russia, Italy, they'd congregate in these towns and they'd basically egg them each other on. So they do these new things. They climb mountains. They do these new sports like tobogganing or slightly later on skiing. And so she wasn't looked down on. She was very much a part of that set.
Well,
but she didn't subjugate herself. When there were times her friend said, you can't do the Cresta toboggan run. It's too difficult for women. And she said, to hell with that, I'm going to do it. And she trained for 3 months. And she was the only woman in the 1890s to get down the Cresta toboggan run.
So, looking over my understanding of history and the history of the world in that time period, it's unusual. Do you think it was her money and place in society that allowed her to be this, what could be considered, a figure that is going against society and the current? What protected her from being trashed? Not drunk trashed, but like trashed by people who wrote about her, people who thought about her, her own family. How is it that someone like this can rise without an enormous amount of backlash if this is unusual in society, or at least partially?
Undeniably, the fact that she had money and was secure in her class position was a large part of it. But there were certain areas in the Victorian world where women were given sort of more leeway to be transgressive. And sports in a limited limited number of instances was one of them. Not all sports. If a woman had decided to play football or rugby, she would have been just laughed off the grounds, and it wouldn't have been possible. But there were sports like tennis and golf, which from the 1870s on, there were quite a few women playing and competing in, not just in England, but certainly in the United States as well. And there were other areas of life. Journalism was one. So there's this wonderful journalist in New York in the same time period called Nelly Bly. And Nelly Bly broke all kinds of stories. She went undercover. She went into mental asylums and chronicled the treatment of the mentally ill. And she, at some point in the, I think it was the 1880s, I may have the years slightly off, but at some point, she decided she would take on Jules Verne's fictional record of 80 days around the world that he'd written about. And he'd written a novel, and he sort of thought you couldn't get around the world on trains and boats and everything else in faster than 80 days. And she proved him wrong. She went around the world in about 70-something days, and she was an international sensation. There were newspaper people all over the place following her. There were telegrams fired off to mark, each stage of her route. So there were these areas of exploration, of sports, of writing, where women were given much more leeway to enter the public realm. But on the other hand, when they did enter the public realm, they oftentimes faced this barrage of condescension. So in Lottie Dodd's case, some of the newspaper men, and it was mainly men, who wrote about her were very respectful. They looked at her, they said she was a miracle. They called her the Little Wonder, which is the title of my book. That was her nickname that the press gave her, because she was wondrous. At everything she did, she was wondrous. But then there were other journalists who decided that it was their right and their duty to mock her appearance. She was, when she was a teenager especially, a little bit awkward looking. She weighed a little bit more than they thought she should. She was big, she was muscular. And so they wrote about that. And they also said, well, she's a tomboy. She's not quite feminine enough. And then they said, and this was probably the thing that grated most, they said, well, she was lucky enough to be trained in sports by her gentleman brothers who were kind enough to spend time teaching her tennis. And the thing was, they were sort of partly right. She did have older brothers. Her family was sports obsessed, and all four of the siblings were absolutely world-class athletes.
Well, it's easy to be sports obsessed when you're not poor.
The thing is,
there's something with your time.
Far and away the best athlete of the four of them. So it wasn't that they were teaching her and she sort of the crumbs. She was the star athlete, and the others were orbiting in her shadow. And if anyone taught her tennis, it was her older sister, Anne, who took her on the tennis tour when Lottie was 11 years old. That's when she first started winning and when the press first started noticing her. So the idea that the men of the family taught her all she needed to know, it was gibberish, and clearly grated with her.
Sasha, this is such an interesting story, and I really appreciate the fact that you took it on and you've written it. I'm looking forward to hearing and reading more about it. Can't say I haven't finished it. I'm not going to lie. Little Wonder.
Well, now that you've moved to Connecticut, you've got all the time in the world.
I've got all the time in the world. Yes. Slow life here. I love it. Little Wonder, the fabulous story of Lottie Dodd, the world's first female sports superstar. We're speaking with Sasha Abramsky, freelance journalist, professor of journalism at UC Davis, writes the column Signal Noise twice a week at The Nation magazine. Sasha, thank you so much. And I look forward to hearing from you next time.
I look forward to it too. Thanks again.